Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Visual Studio Toolbox, live from the studio, although pre-recorded from where you're watching. But I'm your host, Leslie Richardson, and today I am joined by Jeremy Clark. Hi, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Hello. Great.
Cool. So what are we talking about today?
So I want to talk about nullability and null operators in C# because it was something that was added not too long ago. And I think there's a little bit of misconception about it. And I try to clear some of that up.
Awesome. Exciting stuff. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself before we talk about all those misconceptions?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is basically what I do. So I was a corporate developer for a number of years, and I struggled to learn a lot of, I'll say, intermediate level concepts. And so I try to help people get over the speed bumps that I had to get over. So I really enjoy talking to other people, and I do a lot of public speaking, and I really love watching the light bulbs go on when people understand something, because I feel like I just changed the world a little bit.
I agree. Or just like seeing the head nods in the audience sometimes is always good. Like, okay, good. I'm not just like rambling. It's making sense to somebody, at least this person in the corner over there. So that's really cool. I think that's a great mantra to have. So what are you going to be helping us with today regarding nullables?
So I'm going to be looking at, we'll be looking at an application that I use when I teach people about async and task. So back when nullability was added to C#, I had to kind of go in and adjust some of my demos. And so I got some of those potential null warnings. And so I figured it would be great to show like how I converted this app, and it'll use some of the operators, see the warnings that come up, see what nullability does for us and doesn't do for us.
Cool. Yeah. I'm curious to know like the benefits, why I should consider converting to adding all of that.
Well, it's not so much converting anymore, because since .NET 6, it's when you do a new project, it's built into the template already. So it's just kind of getting used to it now for new projects. Okay, so here I have an application. I'll start by running it. And again, this is something that I use to teach how task and await work. So I'll click this button, and there'll be a 3-second delay while we wait for some data to come up. And there's some data. And then there's also a cancel button down at the bottom. So I can click the cancel button during that 3 seconds, and it will stop that operation. So that's fine and good, but this application does have a potential runtime exception. So let's start this up again. And if I click the cancel button before clicking either of the other buttons, now what I have is a null reference exception. And yeah, these are everyone's favorite exceptions.
Yep, I love them. Absolutely.
So let's just see why that happens. And we've just got a few lines of code to look at here. So on line 22, I have this cancellation token source, and that's a class level field. And right now, the nullability is not enabled. So we can say this can be null since it's a reference type. And then in the constructor on line 24, I don't initialize it. So I don't initialize it, and then on line 29, this is the code that runs when I click that cancel button, and you can see it's using that token source on line 31.
Right.
So it's null at that point. That's why I get that runtime exception. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to enable nullability so that we can see how that's different. And for this, again, this is the default. Starting with .NET 6 or later, you'll see this line in your project file. I'm going to uncomment it with, I love keyboard shortcuts. I use Control-KU to uncomment a block of code. So you can see there on line 7, now it says nullable enable. The first thing that I kind of don't really like about this is the terminology, because it feels like I'm enabling nullability.
Yeah, it does
but what I'm really enabling is making reference types non-nullable.
Right.
So
it's a brain
teaser. The terminology is confusing. So with the nullability enabled, and I will need to save before, let me go back and save that file before this will take effect. And what we'll see is I now have a green squiggly under my constructor. And I'm going to just do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to come back to that one later, but we'll reduce some of the errors.
I love the question mark. It's a mystery.
Yeah, the question mark is a mystery. Yeah. But So if I hover over this, it's going to tell me that, hey, that token source field that you have is non-nullable. That means there should be something assigned to it by the time you exit the constructor. Now, the first thing to understand about enabling nullability is it doesn't prevent runtime errors. So even with this enabled, I can still build my application, I can still run my application, and I can still get that runtime null reference exception. Okay, so
what's the point? Why did I uncomment that?
Yeah, well, we'll get to that in just a minute. First, I want to show a little bit more about what it doesn't do.
Cool.
So in addition to that, it also does not prevent me from assigning a null value to something. Now, I do get a warning. It says, hey, you're not supposed to do this, but I can still build, I can still run, I can still get that null reference exception. So it's really important to understand that this is something that happens at compile time inside Visual Studio to help us avoid these null reference exceptions. It doesn't actually prevent things at runtime. Now, what it does do is it allows us to show the intent of our code and be more intentional about it. So let's get rid of this null assignment. Because one of the things, when I hover over this, the bottom line says, consider declaring the field as nullable. And the way that we do that is I add a question mark after the type on this token source field. And now what I'm telling the compiler and other developers is that it's okay if this particular field is null. So what it does enable is it enables us to make the intent of our code more clear.
Totally.
So even though it's not stopping that runtime exception, it makes the intent more clear. Oh, it's okay if this is null.
Yeah. I think that's great from like a team perspective too. So yeah, somebody's new to this code base and yeah, it clarifies things. It's
Definitely.
like, is this supposed to be null friendly or what?
Right.
Yeah.
So now what we've seen is that our green squigglies have moved. They're no longer on the constructor because it's like, oh, well, it's allowed to be null. I don't worry about that anymore. But now on line 31, we have our green squiggly.
Right.
And this is actually where we're getting the runtime exception.
So even better.
Yeah,
now you
even
can
better.
Pinpoint your error.
And it says, hey, possible null here. You might be dereferencing something that's null. And so the analyzers that show these warnings are really helpful, and they're pretty smart. So if I wrap this in a null check, so I can say if token source is not null, and go like that. Notice my green squigglies went away. And so it's saying, oh, well, you're checking it's not null before you do this, so you'll be fine. And if we run this application, I can click the cancel button immediately, and I don't get that error. But our button still works, so if I click another button first and then click the button, our little cancel pop-up comes up. So we are still functioning the way that we expect. Now, there is one thing about these two lines of code, and that they're not thread safe.
Dang.
Yes.
We knew it was too good to be true.
I talk a lot about concurrent code, and I've been burned by not thread safe code a lot. Now, what I mean by that is between line 31, where we're checking to see if this thing is null, and line 32, where we actually use it, it's technically possible that that token source might turn null in between. Unlikely, but when it happens, ask me how difficult it is to debug.
Well, it's got thread in the name, so I assume it's going to be difficult.
Anything with thread
just by
in
default,
the name
that's like a level 10 out of 12 on the debugging scale. Yeah.
So the good news is that when nullability and these analyzers were added to the language, we also got some null operators. The first one we're going to see is the null conditional operator. And to do that, what we'll do is we'll put a question mark after our token source field, the thing that might be null, and before the dot. So what this means is if token source is null, it's not going to process anything to the right of that question mark. So we don't have to worry about potentially accessing something that's not populated. Now, if token source is populated, it's going to go ahead and call the cancel button. So from a functional standpoint, it works the same way. So I can click the cancel button immediately, and we do not get the runtime error. And then I can click one of these buttons and then click cancel, and we can see that our operations are still there. So the null conditional operator is great because now we don't have to wrap everything in if not nulls.
So, I have encountered that problem many times.
And regardless of how you feel about nullable reference types, that operator is really cool.
It's very powerful, and it does free up a lot of lines of code.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's when we have these the nullability enabled, we also do get these warnings pop up on an error list that we can use. And so I'm just going to click on one of these, and it's going to bounce down to another piece of this code. And what we have here, if you're not familiar with tasks and continuations, it's okay. I'll just kind of explain what's going on. So task has an exception property, and that's where we've got our green squigglies here. And that property can be null. It's nullable. If I have a task that finishes successfully, then it will be null. If I have a task that goes into what's known as the faulted state, then exception will be populated. So again, the analyzers are helpfully saying, hey, this might be null here. But I know something that the analyzer doesn't know, and that is what I have on line 60. Line 60, I have something that says task continuation options not only on faulted. What that means is this block of code will only run on a faulted exception. So that means that I, as the developer, know that this exception property is going to be populated in this block of code. And so I can get rid of this error by using what's known as the null forgiving operator, and that's an exclamation point. It's basically, I know what I'm doing. Don't talk to me, I know what I'm doing. Now this, as you can imagine, could be dangerous because if you don't know what you're doing, then you can get rid of warnings that
this seems
are
like keywords in the making a little bit.
Right. But it is nice because otherwise to suppress a warning, if you have to wrap your code in pragmas and things like that, it kind of makes a mess. So the null forgiving operator can be very helpful as well. Let's look at another example where we might be able to use this. And this is actually coming from, not that file. OK, let's go here. There we go. So this is another file, which is library code. And you can see down at the bottom, I have this result that's being returned here. And let's look at the message we're getting here. Now it says possible null reference on this return. And if I look on line 11, there's no question marks in my task of list a person. And since there's no question marks, that means we're expecting that this will not return a null value. So again, it's making the intent of the method clear, but hey, you know what? We might have a problem here. So I could say I'm pretty confident based on this is making a service call. I have control of both the service and the client. And I'm pretty confident that if it gets to this point, it won't be null. Because basically this JSON deserializer is saying, hey, if I can't undo this string, then I'm going to give you a null back. I could say I'm pretty confident that that's not going to happen and put an exclamation point here. And again, that will get rid of the compile time warning, but not a potential runtime exception. So I might want to be, again, a little more safe because I'm not confident of my code. So I might say if result is null, then we're going to return a new list of person objects. So I'll return you an empty list if it's null. Otherwise, I'll return you what I have. Now, of course, this is not cool enough. We would rather use one of the new collection expressions for initialization. And so having the square brackets, that's the same thing. It's returning a new empty list.
That's true. That always trips me up, but
yeah.
Yep,
it's something we're still getting used to. This is a C#12 thing, and we're still getting used to that. So now you can see my green squigglies are gone. That's good. I don't really have to worry about thread safety here because result is it's a method level variable, so it's not going to change. But I would rather use a cool operator. And there is one more operator, and that is the null coalescing operator. Ooh, that sounds impressive, doesn't it? You always have to pick the big words to say in front of your boss.
I agree, right? It sounds important, yeah.
And so here's how this works. So it's 2 question marks, and it has the same effect as if we had this if statement. So it's saying if result is not null, we'll return that. If it is null, we'll return whatever's on the right-hand side of the null coalescing operator. So it'll return that empty collection. So this has the same result. So we've seen kind of the three operators. We've seen the null conditional operator, the null forgiving operator, and the null coalescing operator. I do want to show one last thing, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Bonus.
You're not going to stop me.
No. You can't just tease that.
Yeah, well, you know. So I'm going to go back to this code that I kind of I'm going to stick the question mark on here earlier. And that's because there's an interesting syntax that you can do. And the first time you see it, you're like, I have no idea what this is doing. So we're going to walk into it a little bit. So on line 10, I have this reader property. And it's a full property with a backing field. The backing field is on line 9. And looking at this code, the backing field could be null. That's allowed. But the property should not be null. And so what I've done is set up a pattern that's used sometimes for lazy loading. So in the getter of this, it will check that backing field. If the backing field is null, it's going to go ahead and new up an object, assign it to that backing field, and then we'll return that. So what this means is if I never access this reader property, then this person reader object on line 15 will never be instantiated. So the first time we use it, we'll get one of those. The second time we use it, the backing field shouldn't be null, so we can just go from there. Now, we already saw how we can use the null coalescing operator because line 14 and 15 looks pretty similar to that returning result that we just saw. So that means that I can rewrite this and say reader equals reader, let's see. If I can type properly.
Typing is like one of the hardest things to do publicly.
There we go.
Sweet.
So just like when we were returning that result, this will check that reader backing field. If it's not null, then it will assign it to itself, which is a little odd, but it'll just use what's there. If it is null, it'll new up that person reader and then assign that to our backing field. Okay. Now, do you want to combine some operators?
Yeah.
Okay. Before we actually combine these, I'll show something that will probably look familiar to people. Because if I create an integer and set it to 5, and then say a equals a plus 4, we've kind of done that to increment things. But there's also a shorter way we can do this. We can combine the assignment operator and the addition operator, so we can say a plus equals 4.
Right.
We can do the same thing with this null coalescing operator. So notice just like on line 15, we have a equals a operator something. On line 18, we have reader equals reader operator something. So we can reformat this.
Is it question mark equals?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So just like that. Okay, so again, when you kind of first see that, you're like, I'm not exactly sure what's going on.
Right.
And then, of course, this isn't cool enough because we can get rid of some more of these lines of code, which is what I've seen people do. So we don't need this separate line for the return. So I can return this, and it will still return whatever's on that backing field. And now that we have one line of code, we can use one of the cool expression-bodied members. So this is the code that people walk up to and they say, I'm not sure what this is doing.
Yeah.
I have a getter and reader question equals new person reader.
This is when you pull out Copilot if you have it and you're like, what the hell's happening?
Right. But now that we've kind of seen how that works, okay, this is a combination of the null coalescing operator and the assignment operator. We can say, okay, well, if reader is not null, it's going to return that. If it is null, it's going to new up a person reader object, assign it to that backing field, and then return that.
Nice.
So, you know, null conditional operators, null forgiving operators, null coalescing operators, combining operators, there's all kinds of things.
There really is. It's crazy. I feel like up till now, I use, what's the name of the first one? Just the one question mark?
The null conditional operator.
Yeah, I use the conditional one pretty frequently.
I will say that was probably the one that is most useful to me.
I agree.
So,
yep,
yeah.
I find myself using that one a lot. I didn't know the official name for it. I just call it like the null question mark.
Yeah, I had to look them all up.
Yeah. It's got fancy names like non-coalescing and stuff. But that's really cool to see all the different ways that you can specify and especially like streamline that null process, because sometimes it can balloon into this tons of like nested if statements and things that you're constantly checking if something is null, and it's annoying. And that's great. And like I think the hope is that as those uses start becoming more discoverable with users, that it's no longer going to be an issue of I don't understand what's going on.
Once you start using them, you get comfortable with them, and then it just becomes a part of your regular process.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, that is really exciting. I learned something new today.
Cool.
About nulls. Because I don't know. Yeah, nulls is just like one of those things that we as developers just sort of have to deal with, and it's annoying, and you kind of sometimes you just do equals null or just doing if statements. So it's nice that with the later C# versions, a lot of it is getting streamlined so that you don't have to think about every single scenario.
And this allows us to avoid some runtime exceptions and make the intent of our code more clear.
Exactly. And I like clarity, especially. That's always a big bonus. So really cool. So if people wanted to learn more about nullables and all of those different scenarios, where can they go?
So you can find me on YouTube. I am Jeremy Bytes online. My name, Jeremy, Jeremy, Bytes. And I've actually fairly recently done a video on this topic. And I also have some articles on my blog as well. And my website is jeremybytes.com. That's kind of where you find me online.
Perfect. Sweet. For a second, I thought Bytes might be your last name. I'm like, what are the odds? That's like destiny. That would be incredible. But sweet. It sounds like you've got a lot of awesome resources. So folks, go check them out. Go learn about everything there is to know about nullables and how you can be streamlining your code to account for them and also make it more clear for your fellow teammates and stuff too. So Jeremy, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sweet. And thanks for watching, y'all, and happy coding.